Welcome everyone. My name is Shannon Valdezon and I will be moderating the webinar today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We are happy to be here today to talk about the U.S. land conservation community and how they can use GIS to map green infrastructure. Just a few logistics before we get started. Please note on the right-hand side of your screen you should have the GoToWebinar toolbar. There you will find a section for handouts where we have uploaded a green infrastructure brochure. You are free to download that at any time during the presentation. There is also an area for questions. Please type in any questions you have for our speakers. I will be monitoring this throughout the presentation, and at the end we'll make sure we have time to answer them. As a reminder, this will be recorded and the recording will be made available in about a week. On the webinar today, we have 3 panelists and industry experts who will weigh in and explore how GIS tools and data can help support land conservation decisions and build green infrastructure strategies. We are going to hear from David Gadsden, who leads ESRI's nonprofit sector. This sector supports nonprofits, foundations, and international organizations globally. Then we will hear from Ryan Perkle, a senior consultant in ESRI's professional services division and the green infrastructure lead for natural systems. Finally, we have Rob Stouter, the product manager for GeoPlanner, who will walk us through workflows in the web-based tool GeoPlanner for ArcGIS. We will begin by hearing from David Gadsden. As leader of ESRI's nonprofit sector, David is going to talk about his work with the ESRI nonprofit organization program, which aims to empower nonprofits around the globe with ESRI technology. David, take it away.
Thank you, Shannon. Again, as Shannon mentioned, I have the opportunity to work with many different nonprofit institutions around the world. Today we'll be focusing specifically on some of the ESRI technology as it relates to conservation. It's worth noting that ESRI's engagement with the conservation community goes back several decades. If you're familiar with ESRI technology, it's really a natural step to think about the importance of a geographically oriented tool in looking at landscapes and land management decisions. Primarily from the beginning, because of our president Jack Dangermond's passion and interest in conservation, some of ESRI's earliest customers were applying our emerging technology in the 1970s and into the 80s to be able to organize landscape-oriented data and to bring that together in a GIS in order to look at trends and priorities and management and monitoring of impact across those landscapes. For those of you that don't know, ESRI was founded in 1969 as the Environmental Systems Research Institute. And the intent of that institute was really to bring forward these geographically oriented technologies to help solve increasingly complex challenges. As we've grown as an organization and now serving over 350,000 organizations around the world, our technology has advanced through a very large annual investment in research and development, really an unparalleled investment in the world as far as moving this basis of technology forward. One of the most exciting and powerful recent advancements of that technology platform was the incorporation of cloud computing into ArcGIS. ArcGIS being a collection of software components oriented towards desktop users, mobile technologies, as well as server technologies to connect in and couple together into enterprise systems. By moving those powerful enterprise tools into the cloud, we've been able to establish a platform that our entire user community can benefit from. And there's a major shift in that transition. That shift involves, rather than having very robust, powerful clients that require a lot of training to potentially get oriented around to use successfully, we can move towards into having very focused and targeted applications that are more ideal for specific user scenarios. So I wanted to kind of set this context today about the presentation that you're about to see that relates to how the ESRI platform can be applied to land management, land conservation decisions and planning. What you're seeing are, rather than the entire ESRI software suite, you're going to see some very focused and appropriate tools that land managers in a variety of different settings can make use of. We'll talk a little bit about, in the end of the presentation, about how specifically nonprofits or foundations or government or other customers can access these technologies. But I want to thank my colleagues, Ryan and Rob, and Shannon, for helping pull this together today. We're very excited for what we're about to show you, and I believe that this sort of represents the future of conservation in an appropriate way. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, David. That really does set the stage for green infrastructure and what we're about to see. So now we're going to hear from Ryan Perkle. As I mentioned, Ryan is a senior consultant at ESRI's Professional Services Division and the Green Infrastructure Lead for Natural Systems. He's about to talk about the green infrastructure planning process and will illustrate several of ESRI's recently developed applications that aid in the process. Ryan?
Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to folks on the East Coast. I am relatively new to ESRI, coming here from the University of Arizona, where the last 6 years I had been professor of planning, and worked primarily in the environmental and conservation planning realm. So it's really exciting for me to be joining ESRI to really be at the tip of the spear of where this stuff is moving the envelope forward to help us make better decisions. So I want to start just by talking about green infrastructure, and ultimately, just one second here. Okay, about green infrastructure, and recognizing that we have an incredibly diverse audience out there. I want to set the stage for some folks that may be a little bit less familiar with this, and then we'll get into some of the details for the more technical folks on the call in a little bit. But so generally speaking, when we're talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about that strategically planned and managed network of open spaces, natural lands, wildlife habitats, parks, and a whole series of additional assets that communities leverage in order to deliver those vital ecosystem services and sustain the quality of life for everyone, right? So within this context, green infrastructure planning is really the enabling mechanism upon which we start to strategically plan for those things. And one of the key elements here in green infrastructure planning is that we're attempting to promote both conservation and the development process simultaneously. This is not a mutually exclusive thing where we only have conservation at the sacrifice of economic development, for example. So some of the critical themes in green infrastructure planning is that it's about identifying and connecting those most valuable landscape elements before growth and development can begin. Once we've identified those components, that's when we start to identify locations for transportation infrastructure, housing, all of those other things that we typically identify within cities. GI as a template, as an approach, is really aimed at all scales. It works at very large regional scales, which we'll start to show you today, but it also is relevant to you and your neighborhoods as well. GI facilitates and really aims as the armature for coordinating conservation and economic development efforts, and it's through that marriage of those two things, having this information at your fingertips while you're engaged in the planning process, is what makes this successful. So the critical components of successful green infrastructure planning is really identifying these green infrastructure assets. And green infrastructure assets come in a number of various forms. They could be ecological resources, cultural, agricultural, scenic values, right? And these are going to vary greatly depending on your local geography, in that no two GI plans are going to be the same, right? Because this is a process and an approach that's customized with your local values. A critical additional element in green infrastructure planning is the identification of environmental hazards. And by identifying these environmental hazards and enrolling them in some form of green infrastructure planning, protection rather, we're avoiding all of those terrible headlines that we see on the nightly news. And that not only saves lives, but it saves millions and millions of dollars in capital infrastructure costs by avoiding those conflicts in the beginning. And finally, one of the really important critical components of green infrastructure planning is that we're not just talking about a series of parks and natural spaces, right? But we're also talking about the critical linkages between them. And that biological conservation and conservation biology has evolved to the point where we know in order to sustain species, to promote healthy water, it's about creating and facilitating networks of these resources as opposed to just disparate blocks of those resource areas. So this green infrastructure planning process is one that is very systematic and allows then users to interchange and customize this type of asset identification with the local values that resonate with you folks. So this process and ultimately the approach that ESRI is advocating for is developed by the Green Infrastructure Center out of Charlottesville, Virginia. And their 6-step green infrastructure process is one that we're embracing and ultimately one that we're identifying various elements of the ESRI platform to help facilitate this process along the way. So when we're talking about the setting of green infrastructure conservation goals, this is really roundtables, stakeholder engagement at the local level, bringing scientists, bringing land developers, bringing average citizens to the table to identify what those green infrastructure assets may or may not be. Once we're starting to identify those goals, then we start to move into this data review process. And of course, we have vast assemblages of information available at our fingertips. And the whole point of this data review is that you're identifying data surrogates that align with those values of your community. We then start to move into mapping green infrastructure assets, and that's a primary component of what we're going to demonstrate with some of these applications here in a moment. Once we identify these green infrastructure assets, we start to identify conflicts in a series of risk assessments between future land use development, zoning conflicts, transportation improvement conflicts that might threaten the green infrastructure assets we've identified. And from that, we really move into the nuts and bolts of planning and development opportunities to identify how we work in concert with these green infrastructure assets as opposed to working against them. And then of course the critical stage, the best laid plans are ultimately moved into implementation, and that takes various forms given the various jurisdictions and the level of planning that's going on here. So I wanted to just introduce this as the fundamental process upon which we leverage the ArcGIS platform to really help with every single stage of this green infrastructure planning process. So one of the really interesting and important things, right, as we're starting to talk about green infrastructure planning is why this becomes important for local communities. Okay, and this is really critical because not everybody is interested in protecting the environment for the sake of protecting the environment, right? It's about finding the message that resonates with the stakeholders around the table. And so certainly from an altruistic environmental perspective, there will be those folks. For everyone else, though, we need to find an alternative way to approach them to engage in this green infrastructure planning process. So for many jurisdictions, many folks, it might simply be this is something that we need to engage in because regulations and laws require us to do so. So what I tried to do here is to pull together a few of the foundational governing regulations upon which that start to influence a jurisdiction's planning engagements. And so the important component here is that green infrastructure planning has been identified as a best management practice for achieving regulatory compliance having to do with clean water, clean air, and biodiversity, right? So if a local jurisdiction, for example, is working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and engage in a Section 10 permit, that requires the jurisdiction to develop a multi-species conservation plan, for example. This green infrastructure planning process, these tools and these enabling technologies can help you achieve that, thus satisfying the requirements of that regulatory compliance. So there's a whole series of these. Another area that's really critically important is jurisdictions that are dealing with stormwater pollution prevention permits, the municipal MS4 permits. Green infrastructure is a tried and true technique to illustrate good faith efforts to being in compliance with those permits. And of course, there are economic benefits as well. There's a litany of literature and research that documents the improved property value, premiums, improved tax base, those economic incentives that communities can generate if they're engaged in green infrastructure planning and ultimately have those green infrastructure assets within their community. And of course, there's also a large growing amount of research that illustrates all of the money that can be saved if we're replacing traditional gray infrastructure with green infrastructure. And so this is saving money in terms of stormwater utility infrastructure, any number of additional components with that. So with this, in setting that context, I'd now like to spend a little time talking about ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative specifically, okay? And we will be sharing as part of this webinar, obviously, the website, which is the portal that is your connection to many of these things that we're going to be showing you here today. And that is in the left side of my screen there. But when we start to think about ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative, it's really about leveraging the ArcGIS platform to identify and leverage some additional resources that you folks can utilize in your daily activities. And those are represented really as these four cornerstones, represented as the source data, so all of the information that we've compiled in order to help enable green infrastructure planning. We make that data available through this website, and I'll show you that in a moment. Another component of ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative is the development of our green infrastructure core data. So this is an identification of national green infrastructure assets for the entire country. And that then can be a starting point for your community to start to engage in green infrastructure planning. Also interestingly, we've worked with the Green Infrastructure Center and configured a series of models so that you can pick these models up, insert your data, and generate your own unique green infrastructure plans. And then, of course, we have developed a series of applications that allow folks to engage in the green infrastructure planning process. And a number of those things is what I'm going to show you here today yet. So relative to the first of those four cornerstones, GI source data. This is something that I was very excited about when I had seen this for the first time, because anybody that started a GIS project before knows that you'll spend as much time gathering data as you actually do doing the work. So if I want to start a new green infrastructure project, I can engage in the source data that's available through ESRI's Living Atlas of the World and the information that is compiled for creating these green infrastructure networks. So there's a list of this material here on the right, and if you're interacting in the website, you start to then go and engage in this content of freely available information. And so for GI source data, if I wanted to start a green infrastructure plan for the state of Texas, for example, I can simply click this link, and in a single download, I will have obtained all of this data that's currently listed on this screen, which is immense value added for getting projects started and off the ground. One of the second key cornerstones of ESRI's GI initiative is the enabling models that are available as part of this resource. So as we had mentioned, ESRI had partnered with the Green Infrastructure Center to publish these models and configure them to receive nationally available data sets that can then start to engage in configuring these models to identify your own green infrastructure assets. And I'm having an issue with that loading. Here, it's coming now. But these models are freely available and downloadable for ArcGIS Desktop, ArcGIS Pro, and this allows individual users then to fully customize the identification of their green infrastructure assets. So again, a wonderful resource to get the ball rolling for you folks in your green infrastructure work. The third cornerstone of ESRI's GI initiative is the development of the Green Infrastructure Cores data set. So this is an identification of these green infrastructure assets at the national scale. So when we talk about cores, this is what we mean. These are large, intact, undeveloped portions of the natural landscape. The model that I was previously showing you is ultimately what was leveraged in order to develop this national data set of cores. So what's important to recognize here is that these are natural areas that are at least 100 acres in size and have some minimum geometry requirements of about 200 meters. So the point is, though, in that conducting this analysis, we've identified over 550,000 of these green infrastructure cores, these assets that can be leveraged in order to start the ball rolling in your green infrastructure planning process. It's interesting when you start to look at the metrics associated with these, in that 90% of all of our nation's green infrastructure assets are smaller than 3,000 acres in size, and over 50% of those 550,000 cores are actually smaller than 500 acres in size. So this provides then the underlying mosaic in order to start generating your green infrastructure plans. So the final component that I'd like to spend some time sharing with you folks today then is the green infrastructure apps that are also available on our website. And we have a series of 4 key applications that are really fundamental to engaging in the green infrastructure planning process. These include selecting intact landscape cores, right? So we have this national data set of 550,000 GI assets. This is an application that allows you to move through the identification of those things. There's a prioritizing those cores to allow individual customization to align your goals with those GI assets. There's investigating the underlying landscape characteristics that go into developing those, again, allowing you with full customization capabilities in order to identify those, and then exploring landscape analysis, which allows you to start to engage in suited overlay modeling applications to start to engage in some basic landscape level analysis to identify GI assets. So the first application that I want to spend some time talking about is the Explore Landscape Analysis application that's housed on the website under Resources. In this particular application, users can work with elevation, slope, aspect, national land cover, soils, landforms, and a series of biological indicators, these landscape characteristics, to identify environmentally sensitive areas in your landscape. So this is a pre-configured suitability model that utilizes a series of spatial data sets that are housed on ArcGIS Online. It conducts all of the modeling associated with this weighted overlay on the ESRI platform, on the cloud, so you can engage in this rigorous analysis without even having GIS software installed on your desktop. That's one of the powers, is that this now starts to unlock the analytical capabilities of this to a very wide audience. So users can engage in this particular overlay modeling process to start to identify environmentally sensitive areas in your location. A second app that is very, very useful as we're starting to identify the differences in green infrastructure assets is the Investigate Core Weighting app. So of those 550,000 GI cores, we become paralyzed. This is too much information, right? How do we whittle that down to identify which of those assets are relevant to my organization in my location? This is an app that allows you to engage in that process. So by adjusting the various landscape characteristic parameters on the left of this, you'll then start to select subsets of these green infrastructure assets that resonate with your particular jurisdiction. So from 550,000, you start to whittle it down to a series of green infrastructure assets that's relevant to your organization. Another application that is really critical for the identification and the selection of these green infrastructure assets is the Select Intact Landscape Cores application. And this is a really interesting application in that it allows us to come to our particular location and start to engage the green infrastructure assets in such a way that we can make selections based on criteria that we're establishing. So underlying attribution. The final application that I like to spend a moment talking about is the prioritizing your intact landscape cores. Right? So as we are engaging in that last application to select those GI assets that matter to us, right, we have the ability to share those with everybody in the world by uploading the results of that analysis to ArcGIS Online. And via uploading those GI assets to ArcGIS Online, we can then utilize them in this fourth application to start to further weight them based on their importance to our organization. So in this application, I would actually click a toggle here, whereas I'm going to come to my particular geography. I'm going to find my previously filtered cores from ArcGIS Online, and I'm going to engage them and set priorities based on these additional landscape characteristics. And of course, the beauty of this analysis process is that the results of this can then again be shared to ArcGIS Online, and they can ultimately then be engaged with further in the planning process. So what I'm going to do now is turn the show over to my colleague Robert Stouter, and he's going to talk about how we can work with these green infrastructure cores that we've just demonstrated in these applications within GeoPlanner.
Hi everybody, I'm Rob Stouter. I'm the product manager for GeoPlanner for ArcGIS. And just to date myself a little bit, I've been working in ESRI since before we had an internet application. So GeoPlanner for ArcGIS helps you plan and test scenarios using real-time dashboarding, sketch tools, and evaluation layers. It's part of the ArcGIS platform, It's a hosted web app on the ArcGIS platform, and as such, there's nothing to install. We update it several times a year, so you can just keep working. It gives you pervasive access. You can access GeoPlanner from laptops, desktops, tablets, anything with a big screen, as long as you have a connection to the internet. Today we're going to look at a plan of transferring development rights to conserve land. As you can tell, conservation is a core ESRI value. What you see here on the screen is a map of San Diego. It's actually showing ESRI's topographic base map. One of the really nice things about ArcGIS Online is you have access to many, many different base maps, including this map of from National Geographic. I'm going to switch back to topographic. So these base maps are actually part of a layer list here in GeoPlanner, and I can actually access more data. I can reach out to ArcGIS Online and access data from ESRI's Living Atlas. This is curated, authoritative data sets, including data sets from ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative. We also have access to a legend, and this legend is going to show us types that we have available in a layer, like these available San Diego parcels, which show us a classification of areas or of acreage from 100 acres all the way up to 183. Now in these, I can actually identify on some of these parcels and look at some attributes about these features. For example, this one's 173 acres, while this one over here to the east of Bottle Peak is 109. Now as a land trust or a conservation organization, I might want to know if any of these have a high conservation value. So perhaps we could acquire those parcels or even acquire just the development rights to those parcels. Now in case you don't know, in the United States we can actually acquire just development rights on land. This would allow us to protect natural or cultural resources. We can actually also transfer those development rights to a third party. So returning to that question, how would we know if these have a high conservation value? Well, we could use layers like this, which are those intact landscape and habitat cores that Ryan was just talking about from ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative. Now this layer was actually created by one of the apps Ryan just showed, and I can use it directly in GeoPlanner. Where the darker the green of this is actually the more important this area is for conservation, the more important of an intact habitat core that this is. So note this area again east of Bottle Peak. This parcel here that we see is actually almost entirely within one of those landscape cores. GeoPlanner can actually help us understand a little bit more about this area through a dashboard. Now this dashboard shows two charts. The chart on the left gives us information about those parcels. The colors in the chart actually match the colors on the map. The chart on the right shows us information about those landscape cores, and the colors there match as well. Now remember, earlier I said, the darker the green, the better the core, the more important it is for conservation. Watch what happens when I click on this light brown column. It actually summarizes the green infrastructure cores beneath those parcels. So where we can see that about 58% of the visible parcels are actually 100 to 121 acres. We can also see that almost 17% of those are within our best habitat cores. So what we need to do is make a plan. And to do that, we're going to use the concept of a scenario. Now a scenario helps us propose alternatives. It's just a unique planning alternative. What I'm going to do here is actually copy this existing scenario into a new scenario and then use some GeoPlanner sketching tools to propose some alternatives. Give this a moment here to save. And we're going to revisit that concept of development rights here, where we're going to use some GeoPlanner tools to actually propose what's called a sending and a receiving area. So I mentioned earlier that we can actually transfer development rights from one location to another. So to model this in GeoPlanner, we'll use something called a paint tool, which is going to allow us to actually mark this parcel here as a sending area and this parcel up here in Bear Valley as a receiving area. Now the receiving area in Bear Valley will receive those development rights. The idea here is to prevent development in this area down here by Bottle Peak and actually allow a developer to increase their development intensity up here in Bear Valley. Think of this as a win for both conservationists and for developers. We can actually use that dashboard again to understand what this transfer is and how it works. We do that through something called a key performance indicator. Now this key performance indicator, or KPI, is just showing the development credits that are available for this transfer. There are 5 of them. Think of a credit as just the right to increase development densities in another area. This KPI tells us that a developer can earn 5 credits by purchasing the development rights here and transferring them up here in this red shape in Bear Valley. Actually, the developer can apply them to a housing plan in this receiving area, and in this case, the credits would be, each credit would be worth about 1 house, and of course we have a KPI to represent that housing plan. This KPI tells us that we can accommodate about 366 houses in this red area of Bear Valley. Now that's 361 houses under normal densities plus the extra 5 from our development credits. Now, wouldn't it be useful if we could actually compare this plan to our original scenario, our original plan? Now, GeoPlanner allows us to view things in a side-by-side split screen mode. With a map on the left is going to show us our original plan, our available parcels, and the map on the right will show us our proposed plan. And what we can do is when this does render, we can access information both spatially, or view things both spatially, and through a dashboard, so we can get a spatial and a quantitative view of our differences. Let me just switch this here real quick. Okay, again, the map on the left shows us our original plan. These are the available parcels. The map on the right shows our sending and our receiving areas, so spatially we get a sense of what's different. Likewise, if I show my dashboard, we can get a quantitative view of how things differ. Now again, remember when we saw this before, we saw that there are, of our 100 to 121 acre parcels, quite a bit of those, 17%, are in those high value, best landscape cores. In our new plan, if we do the same thing, we can see that almost none of those 100 to 121 acre parcels are within that best category. Likewise, if I click on this red column here, we'll get no chart over here on the right, which means that there is no impact on those landscape cores. Good decisions should always consider multiple alternatives, so let's do the same thing. I'm actually going to create a new scenario. We'll call it Proposal 2. And what we'll do is repeat that same workflow, just this time using a different area, and again, look at comparing those to understand how these things might differ. Okay, this time let's look at larger parcels. We'll use that same paint tool to propose that our sending area is in this very large parcel up here by Woods Valley, and our receiving area is down here again in Bear Valley, only a larger parcel. And again, let's do a comparison between these scenarios, only this time let's use a different tool. Our tool, the KPI Report, allows us to look at all of our metrics across all of our scenarios. This gives us a holistic view of the performance or the behavior in our project. So as you can see here in our table, our two proposals do actually differ. In fact, proposal 2, the one that we just made, has quite a bit more housing units and more development credits available. So to really incentivize a developer, we may want to choose this parcel over our other alternative. I mentioned earlier that GeoPlanner is part of the ArcGIS platform. Really anything that you do in GeoPlanner can be shared with other parts of that platform. Things like creating story maps or accessing data and maps for Office or Collector. So from GeoPlanner, it's very easy to generate a story map. I just share my existing map with my ArcGIS Online group. Then I open that map in the map viewer. Give this a second to open, where you'll see those intact landscape cores and my parcels. Then I just simply click the Share button, choose Create a Web App, pick a template, and literally it's that easy. In a couple of clicks, I've gone from a design with multiple scenarios and a plan to something I can share with my stakeholders and decision makers so we can come to consensus about how to envision a possible future. I want to step back for just a minute and talk for a few minutes about GeoPlanner. We just looked at a very specific case of transferring development rights, but I want to make sure that you know that you can do more with GeoPlanner. If I go back to my palette, the thing that has the types that I was doing my painting and sketching with, you'll see that I just have 5 types here: sending and receiving areas, and then the parcels of various sizes. I can actually change these as I see fit. Perhaps I'm not doing this type of planning. Perhaps I want to do, I want to create new cores. I can actually customize the types that I have available for design and sketching right within the application. If I'm actually doing another type of planning entirely, we have other templates that we can use for planning and design, including land use planning, special event planning, and then something we call the basic template. This is just to let you know that this tool is generic enough, broad enough to accommodate lots of different types of planning and analysis. Bringing it back to green infrastructure, GeoPlanner has direct hooks into ESRI's Green Infrastructure Atlas and Green Infrastructure data sets, including the ability to generate weighted overlay suitability models using a Green Infrastructure Suitability Service. Now, Ryan mentioned this before, and I want to make sure you understand you can actually do that same type of analysis in GeoPlanner. This tool allows you to combine multiple variables into a single layer that you can use to guide and inform a design. So to review what we've seen today, at least in GeoPlanner, we use the tool to plan and test a scenario where we transfer development rights from an area of high impact to landscape cores to an area of no impact on those landscape cores. We use data from ESRI's Green Infrastructure Initiative to visualize these intact areas. Then we use GeoPlanner for sketching tools, to propose alternatives, to do comparisons, and visualizing impact using a dashboard and a KPI report. At that point, I'd like to conclude and hand this back. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rob. That was a great overview of what GeoPlanner can do and how we can use it in the planning process and with green infrastructure. So I want to kick it back to David quickly. He's going to talk about an upcoming event for nonprofit.
Thank you, Shannon. I just wanted to comment that both Ryan and our colleague Adam Pfister will be attending the Land Trust Alliance rally on let's see, October 28th and 30th. We are conducting a training in ArcGIS that I believe is filling up quickly, so you might want to check in if you'll be at the rally, if you might be able to participate, but we hope that you can step up to the booth that we'll have there or participate in the training to ask more questions and get some guidance from both Ryan and Adam.
Perfect. So now we want to take the time to answer a few of your questions. I want to leave this up on the screen while we're answering the questions. That link that Ryan was talking about, where you could find all of the apps, tools, documentation, everything is at esri.com/greeninfrastructure. Below each of their names is their contact information if you need that. Feel free to contact them and they'd be happy to talk. So just going to kick over the first question to Ryan. We had a lot of questions about the ESRI data. Is it just U.S. data?
Great. Thanks for the question. So the information that is downloadable in those state-by-state packets is, yes, just for the U.S., and that includes the green infrastructure cores that Rob was demonstrating in GeoPlanner and that I was showing in some of those apps. Now, that's related to the Green Infrastructure Initiative and that particular data packaging. On the ArcGIS Online, however, and the Living Atlas of the World, ESRI has curated large amounts of readily available GIS data for the entire globe. So certainly many of the data sets that are utilized to generate green infrastructure, as we've seen here today, are available through the larger ArcGIS Online Living Atlas of the World.
Perfect. And so what do I need to get started with GeoPlanner was the next question we had.
So to get started with GeoPlanner, you're going to need an ArcGIS Online organization and then licenses for GeoPlanner. You can use your own data in GeoPlanner simply by sharing your data to ArcGIS Online. From there, you can actually use Portal for ArcGIS with GeoPlanner, as well as you can use your own ArcGIS server data with GeoPlanner as if you want to.
Thank you, Rob. This is David, and I wanted to just follow up on Ryan's comment that really, if you think a moment about what made all of the tools that you saw today possible, it's not just a development initiative here at ESRI. This is really sort of the current state of where GIS has evolved as a technology platform, and that is so much greater than ESRI. A lot of the data sets that were brought together to produce the green infrastructure cores that you saw are from many different governmental institutions, nonprofit contributors, academic institutions. Really the role to try to orchestrate that together and using a best practice by the experts in green infrastructure, ESRI really played a light facilitation role in this. And so I wanted to circle back to my initial comment that really the advent of cloud computing and moving these tools into this cloud environment, it was really setting up a new opportunity to put these technologies, these powerful tools, in really more people's hands. And we've noticed from some of the comments there's perhaps some intimidation or challenge over the complexity of GIS, and that we really feel this is a new opportunity to bring both powerful but also easy to use tools forward for a much larger community.
Perfect. And so we have a lot of questions about people wanting to use their own data. They have a shapefile or they want to do it on the local level. Can they use their own data in ArcGIS Online and GeoPlanner?
Absolutely. All you have to do is upload your data to your ArcGIS Online organization and then just share it on ArcGIS Online. Once it's on the platform, you can access that data from just about any other ESRI app, including GeoPlanner.
And David, I believe this is a question for you. Where do people learn about discounts and the nonprofit program?
You bet. So if you visit esri.com and go down into the lower right corner of our primary website, you'll see a section there on special programs. And those special programs include the nonprofit program, which my team helps with, as well as the conservation grant program that we've had in place for over 20 years now. In addition to special programs for students, volunteers, people that just want to learn GIS and have a license to support to use while they go through an online training class or an in-person class, for example. You'll also find details there about our disaster assistance program. If you're responding to a major event, you can reach out to ESRI and get whatever technology you need in response to that event. Otherwise, also on ESRI.com, you'll have links to how you can connect directly with our sales team. You can always just dial 1-800-447-9778 to speak with someone about how to access ESRI technology.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I think our final question is about training, right? So some of these may be a little intimidating, like David said. Do we have training? Is it web-based or instructor-led, and how does that work?
Sure. So related to the green infrastructure planning process, we're currently working with folks in the ESRI education team to develop an e-learning course to walk you through that 6-step GI planning process. And the beauty of that training course is it illustrates the various aspects of the ESRI platform that help to facilitate that GI planning. So that's something that will be become available relatively soon. In the meantime, I encourage you to review the website that's shared on the screen, because there's a great deal of background information relative to app usage, the underlying science behind the things that are being leveraged that folks can utilize to self-guide yourself in that capacity currently. You know, and one of the other things that's really important to recognize here is that with ESRI's GI initiative and those 4 cornerstones of source data, the course data, the applications, and the models, certainly allows individuals to engage in that process, right? But you're not in this alone, in that we have the capacity to work with individuals to configure those things more deeply, right? And to engage with you in the process of your GI planning. So in the group that I work with, for example, in professional services and natural resources, we have the capabilities to help people with that, and would be wonderful to engage a number of you with that. Thank you.
All right, perfect. We'll give you back 5 minutes of your day. Thank you, David, Ryan, and Rob, and thank you to everyone who joined us on the call today. As I mentioned, we will make this recording available in about a week. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your interest in green infrastructure. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day.